So the first panel in our exhibit is titled Votes for Women, and it looks at the suffrage movement, particularly here in Vermont, as is the focus. And we really wanted to take the opportunity to give some background, to give some context to the long struggle that women went through just to gain the vote before they had that opportunity to serve admirably in the State House for the last 100 years. They went through something like 100 years of struggle just to gain voting rights and other rights. So we wanted to lay that out at first. Vermont was different than a lot of other parts of the country. Obviously a very rural state with an economy based largely on agriculture. During the 19th and early parts of the 20th century, the state proved a very difficult place for political change to be forged. If you remember correctly, over 100 years, the Republican Party controlled Vermont politics, which left many, particularly women in rural areas, with little interest in politics or little interest in voting. Nonetheless, over a period of decades, there were a number of Vermont women and men as well that advocated during those times and those decades to improve the rights of women in the state. And one of the first and probably best known of the suffrage movement here in Vermont is Clarina Howard Nichols. She was the first woman to speak before the Vermont legislature. She was a strong supporter of both the anti-slavery movement and the women's rights movement in the mid-19th century, and was the editor of the Windham County Democrat newspaper from 1843 to 1854. Made a lot of her thoughts and her feelings about those issues came out in her writings in that piece of work over that decade plus of work. One of her big pieces was advocating for married women's rights to own property and earnings. These are pieces that they are just as involved with in a lot of cases as their husbands may be, but didn't physically or legally own any of that property, so to speak. She was very focused in Vermont, while others were really focused on national issues. She was interested in helping women here in the state gain local voting rights, and helping them, basically arguing that, as she says, quote, having failed to secure her legal rights by reason of her disenfranchisement, a woman must look to the ballot for self-protection. So women playing a key piece in society, often, not seen publicly, maybe behind the scenes in the home, but still certainly a key piece. They felt that they deserved more, justifiably, and the best way to do that was to be able to vote and to be able to cast those votes and create social change that way and create laws and rules that put them on more equal footing with their male counterparts. In October of 1852, along with Unitarian minister Addison Brown, she submitted a petition to the legislature calling for a law giving women the right to vote in school district meetings. And with the support of a fellow free soiler, many of you may have heard of by the name of the editor of the Green Mountain Freeman, Daniel P. Thompson, the legislature did agree to allow her to address the General Assembly, and she did that on October 29th of 1852, becoming again the first woman ever to do that. She was an accomplished speaker at the time, had talked in a number of places, and took advantage of the time. She spoke for close to an hour and a half, so had a lot to say, and apparently did a tremendous job. Thompson called it a complete triumph, and there was one newspaper article noted that her speech was generated a foot-stomping applause from the legislators that were there, although in the end it did not sway the all-male General Assembly, and they ultimately did not take any action to give women even those initial voting rights that they had hoped for. One of the articles did note, though, that Nichols did make change in some people's mind. There was actually a group of women that Daniel P. Thompson had brought in, and the term used was installed in the gallery for her speech, so there would be some women there. And she later recalled, Nichols later recalled, that a woman came up to her and said, "We did not know before what women's rights were, Mrs. Nichols, but we are for women's rights." So she at least educated some folks that may not have had a sense of, what they were missing, almost, or certainly what some of the possibilities were for them, and perhaps picked up some advocates for women's rights along the way there. She was undeterred. She continued from there to push for reform in the state, but by 1854 had grown pretty frustrated with Vermont's political climate and decided to leave for Kansas, hoping to join what was then a burgeoning anti-slavery and women's suffrage movement out in the prairies. And she did find quite a bit of success out there, working hard for increased women's rights. Eventually she retired to California, where she died in 1885, but she definitely left her mark both on Vermont and ultimately out in the prairies as well. The women's suffrage movement from there, from the mid-19th century, kind of sputtered along. There were no real great advances. There was some momentum that picked up in the late 1860s with efforts to pass the 15th Amendment. That same year, 1869, in Vermont, the question of women's suffrage was taken up actually by the 13-member Council of Censors here, to look at the potential of adding that to our Constitution. But their proposed amendment to the state Constitution was overwhelmingly defeated in the House by a vote of 233 to 1. 2 years later, in 1872, two more measures, one that would have granted school district voting rights for women, and the other full suffrage for females, went before the legislature. Both were defeated at that point in time. And in the following decade, advocacy for women's suffrage in Vermont really waned, and there wasn't a lot going on around that. Many eastern states had formed suffrage associations soon after the Civil War, but Vermont failed to keep their groups together after the failed amendment of 1869. Everyone sort of scattered, and there wasn't really a swell of enthusiasm for women's suffrage at the time. Thanks largely to the efforts of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1880, the General Assembly actually passed an act giving tax-paying women the right to vote and hold office in school districts. So that was one step, at least, where they were starting to gain the ability to vote and hold positions that became more and more important for them as ways, when they would gain more rights in the coming decades, as ways for them to have some experience in those areas that would lead to more success and comfort sliding into politics. By 1882, Vermont towns had 27 female school superintendents. So in just 2 years, there were 27 women around Vermont that were serving as school superintendents. So that did have a pretty immediate effect on the state as far as that goes. The 1880 legislation reinvigorated the suffrage movement. It brought some life back into it in the state, with wider calls to build on that achievement with municipal suffrage. And in 1883, the Vermont Women's Suffrage Association, which later changed their name to the Vermont Equal Suffrage Association, was formed, and their membership peaked in the late 1800s and 1896 at 276 members. And the momentum, they just couldn't hold the momentum. By 1900, 4 years later, they were down to 88 members. It really is sort of the story of the suffrage movement in Vermont. There are these moments where there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of people involved, there's a lot of energy, and then something happens, and either good, bad, or nothing happens, and the enthusiasm and the participation starts to sort of wane, and we saw that again at the turn of the century. That same year, in 1900, a law was passed that allowed women to serve as town treasurers, town librarians, and notaries public. So even though they were seeing sort of a dip in enthusiasm at that time, they did still gain some rights at the turn of the 20th century. It would take another 2 decades before women granted further rights. In 1917, there was a measure that would give them the right to vote in municipal elections, and that passed, making Vermont the first state in New England to pass such a law in terms of municipal elections. However, that same year, both New York State and Rhode Island passed legislation granting suffrage in presidential elections. So even though we were making strides, we were still behind the 8 ball. Out west, a number of states had had women's suffrage for a long time, and it was slow to kind of move to the east. But even around New England, while Vermont was making very incremental gains in the early 20th century, we were still behind some of those states that are around us. In 1919, a bill was put before the legislature that would have provided full women's suffrage. It passed both the House and the Senate, and ultimately Governor Percival Clement vetoed the bill. He had long feared the women's suffrage would spur a temperance movement. He was someone who also had stake in hotels and was very much in favor of a local liquor options, and felt that if women had the vote, that some of those options might go away, and he might not be able to serve alcohol in some of his establishments, which was part of it. So a lot of in this story of suffrage, a lot of times it feels like Clement sort of plays the role of the villain at this, and things happen in certain times and for different reasons, but I personally don't think that reputation is necessarily unjustified. He certainly was someone that did put up some hurdles towards women more quickly receiving suffrage. So later that year, after he made that veto, on June 4th of 1919, the United States Congress passed the 19th Amendment giving women universal suffrage, and sent it out for state ratification. And as states began to ratify the bill, it fairly quickly became evident that Vermont would have the opportunity to become the 36th state to ratify, which would put the amendment over the top and solidify it. This Vermont, as you probably know, is I won't say famous, but we're very proud of a lot of firsts here, a lot of important firsts that this tiny state has had, and this was another one of those historic opportunities. A special session of the legislature would have to be called to ratify the amendment, and support ran high for that. There were women's groups, hundreds of women marching on the State House to demand a special session, but ultimately, again, Governor Clement refused to call the session. He was, again, convinced that women would oppose his long crusade for local option liquor sales in the state. And because Vermont missed that opportunity, it was ultimately the state of Tennessee that ratified the amendment giving women national suffrage. And it would be another couple of years before Vermont would amend their constitution to fully have that in state law as well, although it was something that in 1920 opened up nationally. And that's where the story picks up in our next panel, Political Pioneers, with the election of Vermont's first female legislator, Edna Beard.